North Carolina Dems and friends, welcome to the program. I'm Anderson Clayton, chair of the North Carolina Democratic Party, and here's what Democrats are talking about this week. The talk of the nation has been gerrymandering, something we here in North Carolina know all too well. Our state has been a laboratory for new and experimental ways for politicians to pick their voters instead of voters picking their politicians. And if you've not lived anywhere else, you might be used to getting bounced around like a ping pong ball between districts every 2 years, but that's not normal. North Carolina Republicans have passed 6 different congressional maps in the last 10 years. No matter where you live in North Carolina, your congressperson hasn't represented a district with the same boundaries for longer than 2 years at a time in over a decade. We have had different congressional district boundaries for every one of the last 5 congressional elections. That's not normal, and North Carolina is the only state in the country where that's the case. But that hasn't stopped Republicans from trying to export what they've done here across the country. Just look at Texas. If you haven't seen it in the news, 3 weeks ago, more than 50 Texas Democratic lawmakers left their state to stop Republican colleagues from enacting a new map that would eliminate 5 Democratic-leaning districts and replace them with Republican-leaning districts. Here's what happened. Texas Governor Greg Abbott called a special session of the Texas State Legislature, supposedly to address the aftermath of devastating flooding that claimed over 100 lives in Central Texas. At the same time, Donald Trump told Greg Abbott that he wanted 5 more Republican congressmen from Texas. So he wants Abbott and Texas lawmakers to draw him a map that will make it happen. So instead of focusing on recovery for a natural disaster, Greg Abbott and Texas Republicans have spent their special session trying to get away with making Donald Trump happy, instead of focusing on their constituents in need. If Abbott's special session was actually about helping Texans, they wouldn't have used this time to hold over twice as many hearings about redistricting congressional maps as they have about disaster relief. I think he knows what he's doing. Republicans using natural disasters and recovery as a power grab? Nothing that North Carolina's not heard before. In North Carolina last year, after Republicans once again failed to elect their candidate for governor, they used a Hurricane Helene relief bill as a vehicle to assert Republican control over our state board of elections and strip newly elected Democrats of their powers. What we're seeing in Texas right now is a result of the experiments Republicans have been running in our state for generations, and since 2010 mostly. Texas Democrats can tell you so.
People wonder, why should New York be concerned about what's going on in Texas? Why should anywhere be concerned with what's going on in Texas? I'm going to tell you why. My grandmother says this: if you allow yourself to be a rug, people will step on you. No one was paying attention to North Carolina in 2024. There were 7 Republican congresspeople. There were 7 Democratic congresspeople. Guess what? The Republicans rigged the game in North Carolina, and they took 3 seats. I'm going to say this one more again. That's Ebonics for those of y'all who don't speak it. They took 3 seats.
That's Texas State Representative Jones. She's right. The country did watch as North Carolina Republicans fought tooth and nail to pass terrible map after terrible map, eroding every institution they had to in order to get it done, and it's taken them a lot of tries. In Texas, the minority party, in this case Democrats, can walk out of a legislative session to deny the majority party, in this case Republicans, the minimum number of representatives required to be present for any bill to pass. That's why they left Texas, so they couldn't be compelled to come back and let bad maps pass. North Carolina state government is different though, and our Democrats can't walk out to prevent Republicans from passing bad bills or worse maps. And watching the way North Carolina's redistricting has unfolded over the past decade is like watching a car crash in slow motion. And to be honest with y'all, it's not pretty. I don't think anyone 15 years ago could have imagined in their wildest dreams that how this has turned out. But here's how we got to now, North Carolina Gerrymandering Edition. The first of the 5 maps we've actually voted under this past decade was drawn by Republicans in 2011 after Republicans swept the 2010 midterms nationwide, and North Carolina used it through 2016. In 2017, the United States Supreme Court struck it down for being a blatant racial gerrymander. When they were made to redraw the maps, the Republicans made it a partisan gerrymander instead. We used those maps for the 2018 election. The third set of maps came in 2019, when the Wake County Superior Court said that 2018 maps violate state law against free and fair elections. And bam, we got new maps for the 2020 election. They were an improvement, but not by much. Our fourth set of maps came after the 2020 census, the time states are supposed to do redistricting, and as predicted, the Republicans in the North Carolina General Assembly drew a biased map that favored their party. Nothing new, but the North Carolina Supreme Court that was Democratic controlled struck it down before it could be used, leading to a court-ordered redraw that gave us maps that were projected to result in the election of 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans. That decision was groundbreaking. Even while its moral claim was simple, voters should get to choose their elected officials, and manipulating voters based on race or partisanship is wrong. Those were the maps we voted in 2020, and we thought that maybe, just maybe, we were out of the woods. But of course, nothing is ever made easy. And how did it end? After the 2022 elections, Republicans flipped the North Carolina Supreme Court and took the unprecedented action of rehearing the redistricting case from 2020 and reversing the decision, declaring that partisan gerrymandering is legal again in the state of North Carolina. After a decade of fighting for fair maps in North Carolina and finally getting them, North Carolina Republicans took our even 50-50 split delegation, broke up their districts, and reconfigured them to give themselves a 10-4 majority. And that should worry everyone.
Congress has a 3 Republican majority. Ding, 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 ding. So we weren't paying attention to what was going on in North Carolina. And look what we have. We got that big, ugly, terrible bill shoved down our throats.
This was always their endgame. In 2016, Democrats had a majority on the North Carolina Supreme Court. Justices on the court were elected in nonpartisan elections, allowing the best person for the job to win without getting bogged down in partisanship. And of course, the North Carolina Republicans didn't like that. So they passed a law making the Supreme Court elections partisan. In 2020 and in 2022 were hard years at the ballot box for North Carolina Democrats. And Democrats lost in all 5 Supreme Court elections, shifting the balance of the court to the 5-2 Republican majority. Democratic Chief Justice Cheri Beasley lost her election in 2020 by 401 votes statewide, 4 per county. We weren't going to make that same mistake in 2024. Last year, Democratic Justice Allison Riggs won her election by 734 votes and had to defend that victory in court for 6 months, while Republicans spent their time trying to overturn election results, disenfranchising military and overseas voters. North Carolina, our only path out of the eternal gerrymandering labyrinth is through our courts. Because Republicans get to draw the maps, they get to keep themselves in a permanent majority. With a permanent majority, they can change election laws, make judicial races partisan, make it harder to vote, and make it easier to challenge the results of an election after ballots have already been counted. If you haven't been paying attention, democracy has been dying a death by 1,000 cuts. But we have the opportunity and the power to stop it. The only races they can't gerrymander are the statewide elections where every vote in North Carolina matters, and that includes our Supreme Court races. We can flip the North Carolina State Supreme Court back to being a Democratic-controlled court in 2028, but we have to hold a seat in 2026 with Justice Anita Earls. Let's make a long story short. If we want to get out of this mess, y'all, North Carolina has got to re-elect Justice Anita Earls in 2026. We're lucky to have a civil rights advocate like her on our side as we take on the folks in power from a disadvantage, and she's going to need our help to make it across the finish line next year. Y'all can find out more about her and how you can support her at earlsforjustice.com. And before we go today, there's one last thing you should do. Roughly 100,000 voters in North Carolina are at risk of having their ballots challenged when they vote this November. For most voters, that's likely due to record-keeping errors that aren't even their fault. You might even be on the list and not know it. You can easily see if you are by going to the Board of Elections website, which you can get sent to immediately by going to ncdp.org/repair. If you're on the registration repair list, fixing it is as easy as going to the DMV website to update your voter registration or your local county Board of Elections. And for some of us in North Carolina, early voting is coming up. If you live in Charlotte, Rural Hall, Tobaccoville, or Sanford, your elections are already underway. So make sure that your registration is repaired before you vote. On-site voter registration won't serve as a valid way to repair your registration if you're on the repair list. And that's it from me today, y'all. Keep up the fight, and I'll see you next time.